Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. Welcome to the Women in Football series of the Experts in Sport podcast. This series focuses upon the impact of female academics and alumni working in football. Today I'm with alumni Sue Anstiss, founder of Fearless Women, author and producer of the Netflix documentary Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport, and host of the Game Changers podcast. We're going to talk about the future of women's sport. We discuss the main driving forces behind the rise in women's sport, what support is needed to help this growth continue, and what the future holds for women's sport.
Hi Sue, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Pleasure, fantastic to be here.
Thanks for coming on. We're going to talk about the rise of women's football and women's sport more generally. But before we do, can you give us a brief background, just in case there's anybody out there who doesn't know who you are? Especially with the Netflix documentary that's recently been out, which I have watched, which was awesome. So yeah, go. You tell everyone who you are, your background and everything else. Over to you.
I struggle to introduce myself a bit now with wearing many hats, but yeah, Loughborough student many years ago, but I run a sports PR company for 25 or so years. And then in the last 3-4 years, really been focused primarily on women's sport. So driving change there with the Women's Sport Collective, a network for women that work in sport. And as you have mentioned, I've also written a book, made a documentary, and I host the Game Changers podcast. So lots of content to really amplify and celebrate this amazing growth we're seeing in women's sport.
Perfect. Short and succinct and probably understated. So anybody, again, who hasn't, heard of Sue previously, do go and watch the Netflix show. I think that's probably the greatest way to get in and see what you really do. And the podcast is awesome as well. There's a number of Loughborough associated alumni that I, are thinking of stealing and getting on here in the future. So you've already done it. I'll have to think of some different ways to speak to some of those people. But no, it's brilliant.
I do feel a bit like the documentary is almost an homage to Loughborough University, actually. As I watch it back, I realise quite how much Loughborough is celebrated throughout the Game On documentary.
Well, I wasn't going to say on here, but I will. I spoke to Jack a while ago. Jack, who obviously helps you with the documentary. And I have a bee in my bonnet for women's sport, and the fact that Netflix and those kind of people don't necessarily have a documentary that covers the Man City type documentary. So if anyone from Netflix is listening and wants to come and do it at Loughborough, let's do it, because we've got, the netball as a starting point, or the rugby, or all the other amazing Loughborough Lightning franchises. A warts and all documentary series in the background of that is something that actually my students in one of our projects came up with the idea. It wasn't my idea. And I read it, and when I'm reading marking, I think this is absolutely brilliant. And they came up with so many statistics of why this should work. So I think that you've got the University U, the American college one about universities.
Last Chance U, yeah.
Yeah, Last Chance U. And then you've got all the kind of Man City and all the rest of it. You're like, hold on a minute. None of these are really in women's sport. And we can merge both of those kind of things. Look, the powers that be that might be above me, they might edit this out, but I think it's a great idea. So let's go for it. I genuinely wasn't going to talk about that, but I have already. And I'm sure others will come again. So instead of focusing on us getting a documentary and maybe you and Jack doing it for us, instead of that, let's focus on what we're meant to talk about. So we're going to talk about women's football and sport in general, and the rise that has been apparent over the last few years. It feels like the last 5 years or so has really started to kind of ramp up. So what do you see as have been the main driving factors that have helped women's sport get to where it's at currently?
Yeah, I think it's many things contributing. I think in many cases it is those big major global events, and obviously being amidst the World Cup right now, but also 2019, the difference that made. So in terms of coverage and audience and advertising, people becoming aware of women's sport and the impact it can have women's football in that case. So I definitely think historically we've seen those, they call them the tentpole moments in time that really raise profile. But I also think there's been a lot of societal change in the last 5-10 years. I've got 3 daughters that are, they're not teenagers any longer, they're a bit older than that. But just seeing attitudes change in terms of inclusivity, social purpose, wanting to make a difference. I think that's coincided with the growth of women's sport, so that not accepting the inequality that's out there. I think we've definitely seen that more generally across society. And obviously there's been, stipulations, whether it's, governing bodies dictating equality in terms of who's within associations and organisations, more generally across sport, really. We've seen those different things. But success also helps. I mean, I do a lot of work, on a global scale, but success from the UK perspective across all of women's sports, and not just, amazing what Anstiss did last summer, but you just look at the success of our female teams in cricket and rugby and netball and all those things, that definitely drives profile and interest too. So I haven't really given you one answer. Many things have driven that change.
I mean, there's loads of answers, but while we're here, let's celebrate and touch upon it. Obviously, right now, as we're recording, which dates this podcast, but let's talk about it anyway. The women's Ashes, the men's Ashes was brilliant. The women's Ashes was equally as impressive, or let's be honest, probably more so with the record that Australia have previously had. So it went under the radar for a little while, I feel, media-wise, and then when the women started to win, it really ramped up. Like you just said, winning does make a big difference. We've obviously got the netball going on right now. We've got the Football World Cup going on right now. So all the Euro success that we had previously, all of those elements, I think, probably come into it. I'm just looking now at data around this. So obviously in the kind of PR or the media space, the data that I've got in front of me with the 2022 FA Cup final was 49,000 in attendance. The 2023 was 77,000. That's a huge leap. And if we go, back a little bit further, it was 45,000. So the leap over 2018 to 2022 was small, but significant. The leap now is COVID was obviously part of that as well. But the leap now has been absolutely huge in that media space. I know we talked about this off air a minute ago. The participation rates, from what we look at, it seems that people are shouting about participations increasing. From what I've looked at with Sport England, that doesn't seem to be the case on their survey. Now we can dig into their survey and potential problems with that. But what have you seen regarding participation across football or women's sport? What's the feeling on the ground?
Yeah, I think the frustration sometimes is, as you say, we clearly are seeing massively increased visibility and crowds that you mentioned coming into stadia, and in terms of the viewing figures and spectators and fans, some of the Women's Sport Trust, research that shows it's just phenomenal growth. Not just me saying, but it is extraordinary, the change in people watching the WSL or watching those big championships. But it doesn't, and that's important, isn't it? Fans, funding, visibility is really important. But actually, the bit that drives me at the end of it is participation, and is young girls finding sport, primary school, pre-primary school, and it's staying with them through life. So when there is, old as me, 57, but those in their 50s, 60s, 70s are still being active, and all the benefits that come from, helping in terms of loneliness, in terms of bone strength, in terms just all those things we know that sport's important for, as well as obviously physical, mental health too. And so that's almost not my frustration, but I do sometimes think it's hard to see the success at all those different levels. Obviously the elite element is having huge success in growth, but if we actually looked at primary schools, and this is for boys and girls, isn't it, but participation, but the average playground, our girls, we're hearing that there's more investment and more activity happening there, but on the ground, day to day, for parents listening to this podcast, is that what they're seeing? Are their daughters coming home feeling they've got as much access and opportunity as sons to play? And then when they get to the club, are the changing facilities there? Are it's all those little bits, the committee at the club, are they welcoming of all the girls? They get as much kit, as much chance to play as the boys do. And so I think it's kind of endemic across the whole of the ecosystem that maybe it's not as equal, and as much as we're celebrating the growth at the top end, maybe it hasn't. And maybe that's over time, the impact, it will ripple down, but it almost needs, I feel, investment and support at all those levels to make the whole thing work.
I think there's endless points you've hit upon there around participation. Like I said, the numbers and figures that I had, it's very difficult to analyse things at the moment because we are in this kind of post-COVID era. And people can put the numbers out and say it's grown massively from 2 years ago or whatever, which has got that COVID slant on it. But if you look pre-COVID, there's not that much difference in a lot of this. But like you just said, there's a lot of areas. So, examples that you spoke about there. My daughter has started playing cricket, the local cricket club. And what's really cool with those guys is the young junior cricket has stopped, because I think there's a lot of, just finished this week. because of some holidays, I don't think they get as big numbers. But interestingly, for the first time ever, they're continuing, the women and girls, and they're getting the access to the nets, which is like, that's awesome. Like, so my daughter will go, my lad will just have to be on the side with me. But there are those slow movements even down at this participation kind of level. So like you've mentioned there, it's going to take time for this to kind of facilitate through. You also mentioned primary schools there. And, well, I mentioned this before. I literally have just started a PhD looking at primary school PE. So it'd be interesting to see those provisions and 2 hours of school sport, whether that is happening, should happen. What are they spending the primary school premium on? And there's lots of things around there. The majority of research that I've looked at the moment, there's not been much of a targeted approach from many primary schools. I wonder if you think that might be something, specifically, we're talking about women now, a targeted approach to girls within primary school PE to facilitate potentially into clubs and things. Do you think, has there been any evidence of impact of programs like that?
I think one of the challenges in primary school is we could talk for a long time, couldn't we, about the success and rise of the Youth Sport Trust and not demise of, but then all that happened in terms of lack of funding and so on, the growth that was there. And I think from a female perspective, who's in primary schools, who's taking the PE, who they're then bringing in to deliver the PE, their attitudes to boys versus girls playing sports, I think that definitely has an impact. But in terms of that piece you mentioned, then leading from PE into club links and where they go to there, I think there's a huge challenge around, and I don't want to be negative because I'm an ever positive glass half full person, but female coaches, and that's a huge issue. Grassroots coaches in female that pick up those, girls that are coming through from primary school and bring them into, and this is team sport, cricket, rugby, football, etc. But access to female coaches and, the facilities that I mentioned again, but I think that's a really important part of, are there places, affordability is a huge issue at the moment with cost of living, issues. So that, at every stage almost is there. But that said, there have been some amazing programs in terms of the work the FA has done specifically for girls. I wouldn't want to say that that's not happening. But some of the pieces I hear is the Euros raised this huge interest, but then, and there was some, systems in place to direct girls to go and play, in clubs and so on. But actually, is there enough? And sadly, I think often that is the case. There just isn't enough of that support to meet the demand that might be there.
Oh, interestingly, you mentioned women coaches because the other podcast we've done as part of this series, one is around the coach-athlete relationship. And again, we have female academics looking at that side of things. We did have a director of football at Loughborough who was female, Rebecca Savyuk. She was going to be on this podcast with us today, but she has got the job as manager of Burnley Women's Football Club.
Oh, wow.
and had to go and leave and do that. So she's not here. So she really does add a lot to that debate. So if people do want to hear more about some of those sides as well, the other podcasts we've done as part of this series, a really, really great listen for some of those aspects. We do talk about the numbers of the increased numbers of coaches that the FA talks about post Euros, the increased number of young girls doing kind of leadership and coaching awards within sport. Because I think, like you said, how much time, I suppose, is probably a better question actually. How much time do we think it may take? Because we now have this media attention. We have increased money. It looks to be there, not comparatively to the Premier League in football, but at the moment the money is increased. So the spotlight is there. Do we think it's going to be a generational thing where, from our kind of generations that the female presence has not been as prevalent, but will this come through, or are we going to continue to see this barrier at primary school and at the end of secondary school?
Will it be generational? I think it will be longer than we think it will be or we want it to be. And maybe that is just as it is. And I think that added issue of teenage girls dropping out at twice the rate of boys because of but again, on a really positive, we're talking about periods. We're talking about the challenges girls face in a way we never have done before. So I think there has been a real shift in some of those conversations around the adaptations that we can then make to sport, to kit, to facilities for girls as they become teenagers and deal with that too. So I do feel it's probably going to take longer than we might want to. I know in the past the FA talked about by 2024 every girl will have the opportunity to play football in school. Ask them about that now. Don't ask me, but ask them about that. And I think they're quite a long way from that, despite the success of the Euros. And that's due to many reasons, and we know all the issues and challenges that schools face. Lord above, it's a horrible place to be, dealing with all that they are in terms of Ofsted and everything else that comes with teaching. So this is like a small part of all that they're having to deal with. So I do feel, not to put it all on the schools as if it's completely down to them, but I do feel, it'll take time. And it's also about parents' attitudes. It's also what parents are encouraging their daughters to do, what they hear within the home, what they see. But then again, very positively, to the parents that are showing sport, celebrating, listening to women's sport, it's becoming, you talked about the Ashes, the fact that, your daughter as an example, but it can now watch those amazing females, see her dad celebrating those females, play at school, although I think they all feed into that change. So I hope it will be quicker, but I'm conscious of there is quite a lot within the ecosystem that needs to shift.
It was an interesting point you raised there around seeing your dad celebrating, because I think there is a narrative where women are supporting women's sport, which is certainly true, but men are supporting women's sport as well. And from some of the stuff, I've seen some different numbers, but in equal measure, if not more, men supporting women's sport than women, which I think those are people who haven't, still got on that journey towards women's sport, which we know they exist, I think might surprise a few people.
And I guess it's what do we mean by supporting women's sport? So yes, being a fan of watching, following, etc. The men that I like to reach and often changing hearts and minds of are those in the decision-making positions. So those commissioning the content, those buying the broadcast rights, those leading FIFA, UEFA, those big organisations, those sitting on committees and councils who are making decisions about where the funding goes, who gets equal prize money, who gets contracted. Those decisions. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the viewing figures for women's sport, the fans and those following, actually in some cases it's a higher percentage, the LPGA, others it's more men than women that have been fans of those sports. But it's not just those, it's those in decision-making influential positions that will impact stuff at the top that then does ripple right down to impact our daughters in schools and primary school as well too.
I couldn't agree more. But there's so many stakeholders within this that, who is leading this? Well, everybody's leading this, but, who can have that influence over it? Again, everybody. It's those who can actually take control, whether it be government doing something, whether it be schools changing what they do, local community clubs. I coach my son's football team, and I reflect on this a lot. Like, I've been running it for a year. I've never once been asked by any parent of a girl about them coming to join our football team. Then I look at it and go, should I be going out and actually go, no, we want some girls to come here, or should I be waiting for people to come to me? And I work in this. And, there is no guidance coming from the club. And therefore I go, well, what's coming from the FA? This year, so they're going to under 8s this year. And I do know that there is a girls team now being set up at under 8s. And, obviously we can only facilitate a certain amount of numbers. We're already full. We're turning boys down now. But I just reflect on the front end of that and go, well, hold on a minute. Well, should we have been going, no, this is for everybody. But I didn't feel the need to. It was football. But I don't know. I don't know what you think of that.
No, I think without that massive push of something that moves and shifts the dial, the momentum it just keeps on going as it always has for hundreds of years, 150 years. So I do feel that sometimes it feels a bit uncomfortable. We've got to put these in place. And whether that's quotas or that's calling for things that feel a bit like, why are they getting the priority? Because this is the way it's always been. And therefore it will always be until something comes to really disrupt that. And so I think in terms of that example you've given there, then maybe things need to be done differently, because why would anybody feel there was a place for them when they look at a pitch of young lads and, feeling really excluded, and, how hard it would be to hear the stories of the lovely lionesses, amazing, playing in boys' teams, and the abuse they have taken from parents, from other schools, from boys. So it takes a lot to overcome that and be strong enough. And, that's why they've gone on to be lionesses, because they've been that resilient. But actually that isn't what we want. If we want something to really shift and change, then move that inertia. Actually, it's not inertia, is it, to push back up against what's always been? It does take something quite strong and different, I think.
I do, and I don't know. I do know that the FA have got lots of initiatives, but if I'm just thinking of it from our club's perspective, if the dads and the boys, which is what's happening, are continuing to do what's going on, by the time the girls kind of come along, like I know at our club, they start at under sixes, then it goes to under sevens. And then by under eights, there seems to be girls starting to come along, but separately away from the boys. This year, we've played against maybe 2 or 3 girls in the whole time in any of these teams. And I do wonder whether there is just something there that actually, let's get this door opened earlier and let's have this conversation. Because I genuinely sit here thinking, I don't know why I wasn't actively seeking girls or whether I should have been actively seeking girls. It was always open for everybody, but I never had anybody approach me. And I don't know if that's me making silly excuses.
No, it's really interesting that you've come across 2 or 3 girls and they're playing. That's probably no different to when Jill Scott and Steph Horton and Lucy Bronze were playing. They were one of a tiny amount of girls that were playing there. So that hasn't really shifted. But is that because the girls are being now pushed into, not pushed, but encouraged into girls only? There's more opportunity for them to play in girls teams as all girls. Because when the girls rugby is is really a similar case in point too, but girls come into the sport really late as well.
Well, interesting. So my boy plays rugby as well. And within his rugby team, there's 4 girls, which, again, was a surprise to me that there isn't the boys in the football when there is in the rugby. And this is obviously this is one case study here, but it's just an interesting observation. I feel that needs to be challenged and thought about quite a lot, to be honest. And we're not going to come up with any answers here, really. But yeah, it was an interesting observation for me. It'd be interesting from listeners' perspective. They're, experiencing similar things where these things are happening. And if there's any sports where things aren't happening like this, is there change that's happening very nicely? Have you got any examples of where you've seen this working well?
I think it's hard, isn't it? Because I think in sports, swimming, triathlon, athletics, where has always been gender equal, that everyone can come along and take part, it's almost that versus the purely very patriarchal male, the traditional rugby, cricket, football, which is a lot of the work that I do is in those sports. And there, it's not even just that you're overcoming views of young men like yourself, but young men that are coaching, have got young families now, but actually you bring with you all of the history of your having played the sport and what you grew up knowing, and then those that are older than you, so they've never known women or how to include women in the sport too. So I do think it is a challenge. And we do have obviously loads of amazing men that are really open-minded and want to include women, but sometimes it's hard to know how to do that appropriately, and whether it's about the language that we use or it's about how we coach. And I think that there's a myriad of other not complications, but other challenges that come with including women and girls and young women and girls around, around safeguarding and all of those issues too, which I know you've covered on other podcasts. But I think sometimes that, it's actually easy just to go and get a group of lads together and and train with a group of lads. It can be slightly more complicated if we're bringing girls into where do they change, where do they, all those kind of things too. So you can almost understand and sympathise with the fact that it isn't an easy thing. It doesn't just happen naturally, as you've said. It is almost. I'd be interested to know what the governing bodies are doing to put in place to make it feel like it's a more natural process.
Yeah, I think that's the point there. What are the governing bodies doing? What are the clubs doing to educate? And I will go there with the likes of me, because again, it was just, there was no malice, intended.
Yeah.
It'd be great, but we never got approached, but we were never proactive either. Interestingly though, with what you said there, when I was playing football at school, I think we were year 7, and there was a girl playing on the opposition, and it was on the local news in Nottingham. The camera crew came down to film it. As soon as the camera crew left, the manager of our team at the time, who, by the way, was a very good PE teacher, basically went to the opposition and said, "This is schoolboy football. She shouldn't be playing." And she got taken off the pitch. And we as boys then, I remember plainly now, just thought, what's going on? That's wrong. But that's what happened. That was so we have progressed, I would feel. But I just found that interesting. My thoughts being interesting on that we knew that was wrong then. And this is, if I'm being honest, nearly 30 years ago. So it's quite a while ago.
Yeah, and I guess that's almost like the blatant taking off. But is that any different from a club not allowing girls to have access to the pitches until 10 o'clock at night, when the boys have got the best pitches, the best changing facilities? So I do think there's almost like that really blatant marginalisation of women in sport, but then it's also all the other little bits that go on beneath that stop girls and women from playing too, that need to be addressed.
Yeah, I think that facilities things are really something that should be sorted really easily and quickly, but not as simple as it sounds. You know, you've got
Absolutely.
4 men's teams at whatever age, you've got this new emerging female team, and where do you put them? It's a difficult one. That was touched on the other podcast around facilities, and, you know, ladies playing on pitches that the men had played on a few hours before and they were wrecked, and maybe that's a factor in ACL injuries. We spoke about some of those things, which are all things that could be taken on board. Previously as well, you mentioned obviously female dropout rate, and there has been things in the past around periods. And obviously, again, when I was at school, the girls went off at year 7 to go to this meeting, and the boys went, what's this little box you've got? Why can't we have one? Nobody knew what was going on. Now it's hopefully a bit more open. Interestingly though, something came over my desk today around I probably shouldn't be saying anything about this. An organisation has approached Loughborough to look into the potential of having a football match that can be researched, where males get to experience what females would experience whilst on their period. And I thought that'd be fascinating. It'd be a fascinating piece of research if that can be done to maybe open our eyes to some form of reality, whether it's possible or not. This is like really early stages of stuff, but it's interesting that we're thinking about it.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say that you've seen someone, because I've heard of something similar I love that idea of from a physiological point of view, but almost the size, actually, if men were heading in terms of the weight, height, whatever, differential in males and females, but balls coming in, like it'd be like heading a basketball is what I've heard, if as a man, you know, in terms of how it feels as a woman, or increasing the size of the goals so that they're 3% bigger all round, the pitch is bigger around, so getting men to play and see how that looks. You know, when men have critiqued the women's game, almost knowing that they are playing on a pitch. And it's the same for the size of the rugby. You know, that's a whole other podcast and conversation, isn't it? Is do we adapt the sport for the frame, size, strength, power of female athletes? We
touched on it really briefly with the technology side, and at the moment we talked about, you know, we've got things moving forward. So changing it and going, no, actually the pitch is the wrong side. And then all of a sudden you've got no stadium for them to play in.
Yeah.
You know, so there's a lot of damage that can be caused by change, even though, you know, again, when I was a young boy playing football, we were playing 11-a-side and stood around the 18-yard box waiting to kick it out. Whereas now it's much smaller. So it's an interesting development that I'm sure will come, but the financial side and the role model side of it is a really interesting thing to do, because you'd be further away from the pitch. Yeah, there's so many factors in that. They've learnt to play with a big ball. Would it make a difference with a smaller ball? Yeah, there's so many things with football where things could change for females. But as I think, going back to what we spoke about, there are so many different areas that need addressing, that let's celebrate where we're at, because, you know, I certainly think this has been huge. There's been huge growth in the last 5 years in this as a talking point. Everybody's always said for years, women's sport's going to grow and grow and grow. It actually is growing now. And that, you've been around it possibly longer than I have. I haven't seen it like it is now, ever.
No, and especially on the back of COVID and all the whole, oh my God, it's, you know, women's sport, it's over for women's sport because it came back so much later than men's sport, and it was cancelled so much quicker, and it kind of really highlighted the inequalities. Yes, I absolutely think the last 2 or 3 years, those numbers, I was lucky enough to be at Twickenham for the Six Nations game against France, England-France this year, and to be there with nearly 60,000 people in the crowd at Twickenham for an England women's rugby game, when I've been going over the years, you say there might be 3,000-4,000, you'd be excited to be at Sandy Park when there might be 10, and all of a sudden there are nearly 60,000 people. But I do feel that shift has been coming, and now suddenly in these, as you say, those last 2 or 3 years, just the viewing figures for the WSL games on Sky BBC is really quite phenomenal, what we're seeing. And as you've also said, but like the Ashes, like having watched the Women's Ashes this summer, it's just the most amazing, you know, content to be watching. So showing that investment, actually, who knew if we put some money into these women and this women's sport, they, you know, could be even more brilliant than they already were, you know, over the decades of having success. But it's been amazing to see.
No, it has been. And I think we've touched upon, like, how can this continue to grow? And I think we've said, you know, investment and potential changes of sport and schools and NGBs and government. Is there anything that you think, if there was one thing you had your magic wand and you could go and speak to ministers or CEOs, which you probably can, what would be the thing that you would be saying, look, to continue this and to grow this even further, what do we need to do?
I think for me, historically, I would always have said it's about visibility and it's about people seeing it. And I not feel that's done, but I feel we've made massive gains in that in the last 10 years. I think for me, it's about leadership. It's around who sits around those tables and those decision-making positions, both on boards, but also the CMOs and, in terms of the sponsors and organisations, but the sports governing bodies. So the decision makers. So having increased gender balance there, I think this is hugely, hugely important. And I do almost feel a little bit of not a word of warning, but I think that need to ensure that women's football and women's sport is sustainable moving forward. The professional women's game, I do think that it's slightly delicate in terms of we've seen these huge gains and it's amazing. We're celebrating, our female footballers getting massive salaries, but actually, obviously we all want women's to be well paid, but not to just compare it to the men's game and to think that's where it needs to be, because actually if some of the lionesses are getting paid hundreds of thousands of pounds in their contracts, but actually you've got women lower down in WSL or in the championship who are not even getting minimum wage for playing full time, then there's a bit of an imbalance. And the coaching structure and the officials and as we've talked about the pitch, all those things that need to be in place for the whole of the sport to grow and continue and to be healthy in 10 years' time, rather than just celebrating these small wins now. So I do think that's not a concern, but something to be aware of as long as we celebrate this amazing growth and increase. I think just being aware that have we got all of the foundations in place to make sure the growth really happens for the future.
I think it's a really valid point, because we've seen previously, we've seen boosts in women's football in America, in particular, in the past, and we've seen those leagues fail on a financial basis. We're seeing men's rugby struggling at the moment, and built on, a lot of blame going towards COVID, but is it built on that dream and looking at professional football and thinking rugby players should be on the same wages, but economically it wasn't viable? Is it that? And I'm just throwing ideas really there. And netball is a really interesting one, because almost every year that I've been at Loughborough, it's got to the stage where there's no sponsor. What we're going to do for the whole of the netball, as in Vitality obviously have come in and done it, but it's not, it's not been as simple every year on year that they will be there to stay. And netball's grown massively.
Well, no. Vitality is not sponsoring the Super Leagues. There is no sponsor of a netball Super League at the moment as we sit here.
Well, so there you go. I've not been in that conversation this year. So that's one of those, like the viability of that, because the success of that, particularly at Loughborough, it's been unbelievable.
Oh, it's phenomenal, isn't it? Yeah. And I think actually, go on.
No, so go.
I was going to say, even watching, so again, this is kind of dating the podcast, but watching this morning, England have beaten Australia for the first time ever in a World Cup. It's the last round before they go into the semi-finals. I mean, what the most exciting sport, literally edge of the seat, exciting, breathtaking. So I watched that. I shouldn't say this on a football podcast. I'm not a massive fan of men's football at all, historically. Just know that. And you can't love every sport. Just I work in sport, I can't love every sport, can I? But I think just to have, when I sit and watch that game this morning, I think, how can people not love this amazing sport with these incredible athletes? And it was so exciting. And the coverage, you're right there. And because there's less players, you can see their expressions and their movements and everything too. So I do feel that, whilst there's so much to celebrate, I sometimes think, I just don't believe how netball hasn't taken its place and received the sponsorship that other sports have. It is really quite frustrating when you see how brilliant the game is.
I'm 100% with you, right? So when I joined Loughborough, I was invited to go and watch a Lightning match. And I went and I was astonished at the standard. So I'm one of those people, I love sport. And I can go and watch sport. And if it's of a level that you can just go, wow, then I'll love it. I lived in Australia for a while. I went to watch Aussie rules football. And I genuinely thought, I didn't like it. I just thought the standard, I genuinely thought I could play that. I was probably slightly wrong. I watched rugby league in Australia and I was blown away at how good they were. I went to watch netball and I was absolutely astonished at the speed and the standard, Mary, who used to play golf.
Yeah.
She doesn't miss. It's like, what? It's unbelievable. I mean, she's pretty tall, but she doesn't miss. So the standards class, and then I went to the Copper Box, and there was 5,000 or 6,000 people there at one of the games, again, a lightning game. The atmosphere was incredible, and again, the performance was unbelievable. So I've always found it difficult to go, why is that sponsorship not there? Why is this not elevated to the level that it could be? Because I agree with you.
And I think a number of things. I can say when I went to Australia and watched Aussie Rules football, it was women's Aussie Rules football, and that's why my face then, you couldn't see my face on the podcast, but I was like, because it was extraordinary to watch these amazing athletic women. That was in 2020, I would think I was there, 2019. But I do wonder with netball, and I know we're talking about football here, but I wonder with netball, because of the femininity, because we play in dresses, because we've made it a really female sport to differentiate ourselves, whether that there doesn't help the sport in terms of accessing private equity investment, whether it's funding and sponsors and broadcasters, because who are the people that are running those organisations, the brands, the sponsors? It's men. And so whether they're, I don't know this is my opinion, but whether that hasn't helped netball, because I can't see any other reason, because it is the most amazing, exciting, fantastic. We've had huge success. It's most played sport, for women and girls across. So how could it possibly not have that huge success? So for me, I can only equate it to that must be a reason why, potentially.
It could well be that. So any men or boys listening to this who aren't sure about netball, go and watch it at that level, that elite level. It is phenomenal, and people should try and support it more. It's gone slightly off piste, but not fully, because we the podcast is on football, but we are also talking about female sport in general. You've mentioned obviously trying to influence those CEOs and having that gender balance on boards and things like that. If that was possible and things continued, where can you see things, or where would you like things to be in 10 years' time? Where do you think the future is for this?
I do feel we've got that momentum that we can't go back now. I do think now enough's moved forward, enough's changed, because part of it is around legislation and more formal decisions. It isn't just on a whim that the decisions are being made. So I think the numbers that we're seeing, the viewing figures from a commercial perspective, it's hard to go back and undo the growth that we've seen. So in 10 years' time, I don't feel we can keep going at the momentum that we have for the last 2 or 3 years. That would be fantastic, but I don't think it will. So I guess it is almost moving forward and settling slightly and finding its place. And I guess that comes back to the whole, is the ambition for an equal sports industry? I don't think we ever will have, because I feel like we're always going to be 150 years behind men, and it's impossible to catch up for as long as more investment and so on keeps coming into men's sport. And who knows what's happening now with Saudi and other investment, but actually that perpetuates what's already there, because whatever you think about Live Golf, it was just for men's golf, and actually from a football perspective, it's men's football that's being invested in at the moment. So I think almost what's already there gets more investment. So we'll always remain ahead. And actually, whether we should be, wanting that for women's sport anyway, I think women's sport can be different and better and more progressive, more inclusive than men. So there's a slight danger when we say we want to be completely equal to. I think what we want is equity, the equal opportunity, equal access, the chance to for women to enjoy sport without being judged for doing so, and having as many opportunities. But it might not be a popular thing to say, but I don't know. I was on a podcast last week, actually. It's almost like, when did we celebrate the first £1 million female player? It's like, that could be something to celebrate, but actually I'd much rather be celebrating a fantastic system pathway for girls coming through into football, or new facilities being built, or 1,000 more female coaches coming in to bring girls from all backgrounds, from all ethnic backgrounds, from different socio-economic backgrounds. So for me, that would be more to celebrate than one player who's being paid £1 million. But in the society that we live in, sometimes that's kind of how we measure success. That isn't necessarily how I would see success.
Yeah, that success piece is quite interesting, isn't it? That again, I would agree with you totally, that it needs to be spread. I think, again, from your economic perspective before, one person earning a couple of 100,000, somebody scraping around having to do part-time work and all the rest of it, and coaches are being volunteers, and all those things are things that really need addressing before things can get to that equitable place with male sport. And it's interesting you say about, should you be aiming for that? Because that's what you hear in the news all the time. We want equal pay, we want equal this, we want to be the same. And I get it, but it's interesting to hear you say that because, obviously I love sport, but elite sport isn't necessarily what it's cracked up to be in many aspects. Sport is a brilliant thing for many people, but there's a lot of negatives. I mean, we won't go down any rabbit holes with like academy football and things like that, and kids at 7 years of age having their dreams shattered by going into academies and getting bombed at that age. It happens. It's ridiculous, but it does. So there's a lot of problems in male sport as well, is what I'm trying to say, that, you don't necessarily want to try to emulate towards. Yeah,
I was going to do a small plug. For Ben and Jack's documentary that they made just before we made Game On, called Sidelined, which actually follows male athletes, those who have been dropped from academies, and how it impacts the rest of their lives. So, go and watch the documentary, everybody. But also, absolutely. Yeah, we don't want to be making, in 10 years' time, we don't want to be making the female version of that same documentary to highlight those sad things. And it is a bit of a careful what you wish for, I think.
Yeah.
But let's envision women's sport that could be more collaborative, more with, and the danger is, as money comes in and human nature and all that, and the injustice. So when we talk about equal pay, equal prize money, absolutely, for the FA Cup, there should be equal prize money for the FA Cup. I've no question about that, because that's money that then filters down to all the players, to the teams, to the infrastructure for the World Cup. But yeah, absolutely. If we're selling it and it's on the same stage and it's being funded in the same way, then there should be equal prize money in those things. I guess it's just the almost those outliers of the exceptional individuals that then have the repercussions across the whole of sport.
Yeah, no, I get where you're coming from with it. I know some people might be, oh no, it should be all the same, but from that viability you're talking about, in certain aspects, yes. In certain elements, well, it's not in that place yet. So we've got to be realistic about some of this, I would have thought. It's been great to speak to you. We're kind of, coming towards an end now. And I think it's good that we've touched upon loads of these things that weren't on our agenda. But it's really good to see the rise in women's sport. And obviously, coming from the PR background and you saying that for it to be seen is what you wanted, and now it is seen, and I think that's brilliant. I think all these other elements, like participation being equal, and us trying to work on that dropout rate and stopping that happening at primary schools, at secondary schools, where it does happen. The professionalisation of things in women's sport, whether that be coaches and facilities and support staff and all that. But as you mentioned, the big one, really, those decision makers, having more influence, having more gender balanced boards and CEOs at that level making those decisions could make all that difference. So if we sat down here in 10 years time, I would love to see all those things changed. I would love to have yourself and Jack directing the documentary I spoke about at the first. You're gonna plug another documentary from Jack, and I'm gonna go and watch it. I might get Jack on here again, maybe get both of you when you've had a Loughborough Lightning female sport documentary commissioned. Yeah, then we'll get back on and talk about that. But yeah, it's been wonderful to have you on. I don't know, I'd love to leave you with a final word on the future of female sport, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I am. As I say, I'm a positive person, but you can't look around here and now and not be excited for the growth that we've seen. And it is to kind of the reach. I think they're reaching people that perhaps haven't been touched by women's sport in the past, haven't seen how magnificent it can be. So yeah, I'm really excited for the future.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue. Been really great having you on. I massively appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been fantastic.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@alborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.